Today is Sunday, November 24th, 2024, and this is episode 286 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Good afternoon, Jerry. I had to check. It really is this deep into November. That's kind of crazy. I don't know how that happened.
Yes. Just, basically 1 month till Christmas.
That's true.
Been a heck of a year.
If anybody's shopping for me, I wear a size Gulfstream 650.
It's a good hint. Good shopping advice for you.
Just saying. And, if anybody's shopping. But
how are you doing?
I'm good. It's for those who don't know, we started a second show where we've been doing interviews called Getting Defensive. And it's kind of weird. It's just you and I again. Because we've been doing so many interviews.
And a lot back to back. I think we've probably done 8 of those interviews since the last time we've done one of these. So it's kind of weird.
It is. But hey, if you're interested, check it out. It's a different podcast feed. You can find it all on all the different podcast platforms and on YouTube. But it's Jerry and I trying to do our best imitation of interviewers of cool people in the security industry. We've had 4 episodes, I think, published so far.
Correct. Yep. There'll be a 5th dropping probably tomorrow or Tuesday.
Yeah. And I think our most recent one that we published this past week was Andy Green, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about all sorts of cool stuff around. He's a professor at Kennesaw State University, which is a university here in Atlanta, and talking about all sorts of cool stuff that he's doing research-wise around vulnerability sort of disclosure motivations, and then also a really interesting story about how he got caught up in a whole voter machine security scandal and disclosure that went sideways. So pretty cool, interesting discussion.
That was fascinating. I heard about that whole story on the periphery, and just transparently, I'm doing a teaser. So everybody wants to go and listen to that show. But
That's right.
I being in Georgia, and this was a story about the state of Georgia's election issues in, was it 2020? He was, his university was chartered with some aspects of election security, and through no fault of his own, he ended up in kind of a weird and problematic position. Fortunately, it worked out for him. But it's a really fascinating story that I would encourage you all to go listen to.
Yeah. And for the record, the other 3 before that we dropped, Amanda Berlin, who's been a longtime friend of ours, doing really cool stuff around mental health and wrote a cool book. Liz Wharton, who is well known as a really interesting confluence of like legal skills and infosec skills and business executive skills, and that was a cool discussion. And Alan Liska, who is really well known for his work in ransomware, as well as now writing comic books, all sorts of cool stuff. So we're trying to find interesting folks that you guys might want to hear from. If you have ideas, send us suggestions.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into the stories for this week, just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not necessarily those of our employer. At least for those who have employers. Right?
True.
Hint.
Look, man,
I believe the proper word is that I'm a free agent. And so
you have a powerful need to buy groceries.
Yeah. That's right. So I'm waiting for my kind of like baseball and football. Like I'm waiting for my, $500 million contract. I assume somebody has lost my contact info.
Yeah. It's kind of like when the Nobel Peace Prize comes around every year and I just wait for the phone to ring and it just doesn't.
It probably just doesn't go through, and then they have to go to the next person.
That's fair. And I'm bad about answering my phone if I don't know the phone number. So, you're probably right. I should just answer.
Nobel Committee junk.
Well, here's the thing: if we get this other show off the ground, we can just get some of that Rogan money, and
oh, that's true.
You'll be set. So,
We signed up on Spotify for like $1 billion. It's going to be amazing.
If we can get staff to quit in protest of our show, I consider that a win.
Maybe we could hire people with the express intention for them to quit in protest.
Oh yeah. Like protesting my stance on like 2-factor authentication or something, and just, how terrible that is.
Exactly.
There's no such thing as bad press. I love this plan.
We could hire people to like picket out in front of like city halls, and
that's true.
It's a great idea.
It's brilliant.
Anyway, I digress. So our first story for today comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is 0 Days Win the Prize for Most Exploited Vulns. So CISA, the cybersecurity, I still hate this name. I remain hopeful that someday somebody will fix this abomination, this injustice on the world of calling it the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Like, I just think that it's just wrong. Anyway,
is it like calling it like an ATM machine?
Yes, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. It hurts. It hurts. Like it actually hurts me to say it. So anyway, CISA, I'm going to call them CISA because I don't like the full name, released a report. They do good work, by the way. And so it's not a slight on them. It's a slight on their name. And whoever came up with the name should feel bad. But now if I'm done now and we can move on. They released this report, which enumerates, they've done this for several years now, basically the top exploited vulnerabilities. And I will say, I do want to take just a slight diversion. If you rewind a while ago, CISA started this KEV. It's the known exploited vulnerabilities list. And for a long time, I would characterize it as a bit of a joke. Like, things would be exploited for a very long time, and then somebody would wake up over there, and then they would add it to the vulnerability list. And the intention there is, by the way, that when something gets added to that list, U.S. government agencies, and others that may be acting on behalf of the government have to take swift action to remediate those vulnerabilities. Like they have a hard timer. Right. You don't get out of fixing them. You have to fix them. Full stop. But over the past, I would say 2 or 3 years, that has transformed into something that is actually really useful. Like they are very timely. They're updating it on a timely basis, and I think it's become something of a reliable resource. And so I want to give them kudos. I don't know what changed. I don't know why it changed. Something changed, and I think it's awesome. So
no, it's good. I completely agree. By the way, I hate to be so snarky about it, but it was like, you'd hear from the government news that I found out about on open source a month ago, right? It's like did you ever get involved with any of the FBI driven like ISACs and such that were like, privileged information? I'm like, I just read about this on Dark Reading a month ago. It's not that privileged. It was so slow, and I think that's just some of the inherent problems with government, right? They have so much red tape, and that they can't move at the speed that we want to move at. So yeah, you're right. Something must have changed, and I'm happy for it. And frankly, I do find it helpful. I think we saw some other stats just came out in the last week or two that the amount of new CVEs versus exploit activity witnessed and categorized in CVEs was something like 0.5% of the actual CVEs were truly known to have been exploited. So that's like this huge gulf of like, which one should I patch? And, in patching everything, by the way, I'm just going to state for the record, is not always a viable option. Like I need to prioritize somehow. So having some sort of, and I'm seeing tools build in awareness and alerting around the KEV, which is helpful. And it allows me to sort of give better risk-based guidance on what to work on. But back to our article today, what's really interesting is we kind of have operated under the assumption that most threat actors don't want to burn 0 days. They want to keep them for the most juicy targets, the most interesting targets. This article kind of flies in the face of that.
Yeah, their reporting here shows that in 2023, over half of exploited vulnerabilities started off being exploited as 0 days, which is quite interesting. So, basically, that means that the majority of exploit activity is happening against vulnerabilities that do not have a patch yet,
which is a problem.
Yes.
It makes it more difficult.
Yeah, and so they enumerate a couple of different strategies. One from the perspective of software producers, and one from the perspective of consumers. And certainly from, I would say that a lot of the work I'm seeing the U.S. government do recently is in the space of producers, right? They're trying to drive discipline around software lifecycle management, software development lifecycle, and memory safe languages and lots of other adjacent processes. But not all of us are in the business of creating software. A lot of us are in the in the seat of having to deal with the impacts of software that other companies write that we're more or less forced to operate, which in turn has these 0-day vulnerabilities. One thing that I found particularly interesting, because they do enumerate like the top, I think it was the top 15 vulnerabilities that they saw exploited as 0 days. Out of the 15, 6 of them were what I would call like core network infrastructure stuff, like from Cisco and Citrix and Fortinet. And there were some from Progress, certainly MoveIt software was there, Atlassian, Apache. But there's a lot of things I would say are typically expected to be on your edge that were part of this, group of systems that were exploited. And that kind of flies in the face of, just don't expose it to the internet. Like that starts to break down when in fact the problem is with something that you're intentionally buying to put on the edge to protect your other stuff. And then it ends up being the way that people get in.
Well, yeah, I had a very similar thought. But then I was thinking, okay, is this a statistical bias situation where if I'm doing a good job of isolating everything else, the only thing I'm exposing are these tools that are meant to be exposed. So therefore they're getting more rigor and more attention. I don't know. I don't think that's true, actually. I think we're just in this weird cycle where these tools that are on the edge have gotten weak and more easily attacked. But it's tough to know. Like statistics are so tricky of this game theory going on of what's exposed versus not exposed versus, development lifecycle versus what's reported versus what's kind of. It's so tough to know. But I think nonetheless, what this tells me is somehow think about and game out what happens if that perimeter device that you have to have exposed gets hacked. Right.
Yes.
And how do you mitigate that? Right. Whether it's through more segmentation, through more monitoring, through more less trust inherently between your devices, and forcing still traffic to be authenticated, even with assumption of a bad actor sitting on that perimeter device. Okay, how do I still authenticate that traffic? I mean, every environment's a little different, but that's the kind of stuff I think about in light of this news.
Yeah, definitely. I would also say, I know every one of these is a little bit different story, but there are several which are, the vulnerabilities are in components that don't necessarily need to be exposed to the internet. So while, for example, your Cisco firewall is, it's intended to be on the edge, the management console for it doesn't need to be. And I think like with I think it was Fortinet, and I apologize if I'm wrong on this, but I think it's Fortinet. Like the default is that its management console is internet facing, and you actually have to take like steps to change that. And so I think there's also kind of a least privilege, and I don't necessarily mean that in like an IAM stance, but like if you don't, I think you need to take a very close look at how your devices, especially on the edge, are configured to make sure that you're minimally exposing things. Because it does seem like, in one of the recent shows we did, we were making fun of one of the providers was using PHP in their management console. Well, like you don't have to have that exposed to the internet. We can make fun of it all the time, but like that shouldn't be exposed. It wasn't really intended to be exposed. And I will also say that, back to your point about how to think about this, I think one of the, if you go back a couple of years, I think there was a kind of a moment, a pause in the industry caused by some researcher finding a serious vulnerability in one of these firewalls. Yeah. And I think that caused a lot of both, the bad guys and the good guys to start investigating these firewalls, which I don't think had really had any like substantial focus by the security industry. Like it was just kind of not on everybody's radar, and something happened. And as we see all the time, once one thing happens, like there's this mad rush, to go look for other things. When we saw Log4j, like, there was the initial Log4j vulnerability, and then there was just this freight train of more vulnerabilities that kept getting found. And I think we see that, quite often. And I definitely think that was the case with this, and is going to continue to be the case, because I really feel like security vendors are some of the worst offenders at writing secure software.
Having worked at a few. I think we've both worked at a few, and I think it's absolutely true, which is fascinating because part of their entire reputation is based on trust and security. But I agree with you, by the way. You've made this point over the years, and I certainly don't disagree that when the research community or the bad guy community gets a hint of one class of problem, they then take that and replicate that investigation or that class of problem proof of concept across many, many, many different environments that they might not have tried before. It gives them a new template to test against, basically, or to look again. And speaking of Log4j, just randomly, it's funny, we still see attempts all day long against our web properties with Log4j in my current environments all the time. So it's still hanging around.
I think we're going to see Log4j. I strongly suspect there are still actively sold things that have vulnerable versions of Log4j, just because we have such limited visibility into what gets incorporated into software. And I mean, I think it's not everywhere. Like I think the industry has done a pretty good job of eradicating it, but like I'm quite certain it's still there some places.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So one of the other findings of this report was that the usefulness of exploiting a vulnerability tapers off from the perspective of an attacker after about 2 years, and I think that's because after about 2 years, there's a majority of the landscape has either sunset the technology or has applied the patch or what have you. But I found it interesting that we've talked a lot in recent episodes about the importance of patching and how, like, as an industry, we don't do a great job of that because it's not very sexy, and like we're struggling with labor shortages, or it's not the right way to say it, right? But we don't have enough people to do everything that needs to be done, and patching tends to fall off the side because like everybody wants to play with the new AI enabled, whatever, and so that's just something that takes a back seat. But here we're saying, like, even if you're doing a great job of patching, it may not be enough, and so you really need to also be focusing on mitigating controls, looking, your ability, as you pointed out, to quickly detect that something was exploited and bypassed, or secondary controls, looking at things that are on the edge, and how how do you mitigate an exploit of that from resulting in deeper penetration into your network. So these are certainly difficult times. As we'll talk about a little bit later, like there's a lot of opportunity for adversaries. Like this is the world is getting more dangerous, not less dangerous. And I think it's becoming more important that we pay attention to these mitigating controls.
Yeah. Especially when you take into consideration, even for those that have a patch before an exploit appears, we're seeing that window shrink so rapidly that it's almost becoming impossible to patch fast enough.
Right.
And then, there's risks with patching. We see this all the time. If you patch too fast, you could introduce a production outage or a production issue. So I'm not saying patching is important. I think it's absolutely foundational, especially because we're not even talking about lateral movement or privilege escalation or any sort of inside, once somebody's inside, how they might move around, which matters, right? You can't just focus on the edge. But what I think this is telling us is that we need to also build our defenses with the assumption that we haven't been able to patch a problem before it's exploited in some way. And how do we know and detect that?
Right. Yep. Absolutely. So our next story comes from Bleeping Computer, and the title here is GitHub projects targeted with malicious commits to frame a researcher. I don't know what struck me with this one, but I thought it was worth talking about because I just found the whole thing fascinating.
Yeah, it's wild.
There's a and one of the most fascinating things is like the victim in this is somebody named Dark Mage with the Twitter handle Evil Dojo 666, who is apparently the victim of this. So there was a set of commits to a software or a GitHub repository. It's EXO's GitHub repository, which I think is that they do some AI hoopla, which contains some encoded Python. So it basically looked like kind of random numbers, but they were included in a way that they were decoded and then run. When you decoded them, they unrolled into some Python that connected to the website of this quote victim, this evil dojo person, and looks like it attempted to download some commands that would then get executed. The issue is that this person says that it wasn't them, that the endpoint, the directory on that website never existed, that GitHub account did not belong to them, and all by the way, all appearances are that he's being truthful.
Yeah. And apparently this is not the first time that he's been targeted in this way. But it's fascinating on a couple levels. One, the concept of obfuscated code that was put into a pull request that if you didn't know what you're doing could have been approved and could have legitimately, if it were a true bad guy, pulled some sort of backdoor into the code is interesting. And then that this is being done to frame this guy is also fascinating. But fortunately, logs don't lie, at least not usually. And he's got the receipts to prove it wasn't him, but it's a crazy story.
Yeah, that commit never made it into the actual code base. which again points out the importance of assessing commits before you accept them into your code base, especially when you are, as this this GitHub project is accepting contributions from the community. Like, we've seen quite a few instances, most famously in recent times, the XZ, which I actually mentioned in this article, where one of the committers basically bullied other people into, accepting that person's contributions, which it turned out to be malicious. So I think it's important. Like, there's a couple lessons here from my perspective. One is it's really important to do a thorough job of assessing code contributions. And I think it's also important not to necessarily jump to conclusions until you've had a chance to investigate. Because, like in this instance, this person, this is very clear to me that this was somebody trying to harass, and seriously, significantly so, perhaps trying to get them in trouble with the law, which is not a trivial matter. To make sure that you are thoroughly investigating what happened before you jump to a conclusion. So
yeah.
So there you are.
Another quick aside is interesting. Some of the automated tools that you can run against your code flag this particular one as like highly suspect, which is kind of nice. So yeah, there's some value in those code tools in this sort of instance.
Well, and I think that's very true. But I also think, in my mind, like I think that it was intended. It was, because if you look at the Python code they used, it was like dead stupid simple. Like it was as basic of an attack technique as you could possibly get. And so to me, it seems like it was put behind a thin veil, and I think they knew that it was going to get caught by something with the intention of it, not being there to actually drive exploits, but to cause problems for this person. So, but you're right. Like there's lots of tools out there. It did catch this, and damn it, we should use them.
Indeed.
All right. Then the next article comes from the Hacker News, and the title here is Microsoft launches Windows Resiliency Initiative to boost security and system integrity. So this is largely an outgrowth of the big blow up with CrowdStrike or earlier in the year, but I think it's turning into something that has lots of arms and legs, which are, I think, not a bad thing. One of the most, to me, seemingly significant improvements that they're making is the ability through remote configuration management to revive workstations that aren't bootable. I don't actually know them. Yeah, I don't know the mechanics of how that works.
Yeah,
but that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm like, how? Like something at the firmware level on the motherboard, something in the BIOS, or what is now no longer called the BIOS, but some sort of pre-boot, or some sort of boot side loader that like it's like a recovery partition on the drive. I'm very curious how that's going to work, and what the edge cases are. Like how well does it cover all the circumstances? It's cool. Don't get me wrong. Like I like that they're working on it. I'm just very curious how it works.
And does it open new avenues for attack and exploitation?
Well, of course it does. Why wouldn't it? Come on now.
That's going to be the $1 million question. But go ahead.
Our next business is going to be writing EDR for that side loader.
I like
to protect it.
That's a great idea. It's a very good idea. When I read that, one of the use cases that came to mind was ransomware attacks.
Yeah.
So if you have a fleet of systems that were wiped, they evaded all of your other most excellent controls, and now everybody's staring at at an unbootable system. Would this potentially give you the ability to restore en masse without dispatching people to recover? I mean, I think the use case to me very clearly was what happened with CrowdStrike, where somebody had to go and touch each one of the systems that were impacted and run through some process. But it makes me wonder if could it also be useful in like a ransomware type attack?
I guess it depends. It all depends on what data is able to be backed up and restored. Is it just key system files? Is it, I don't know. To be determined.
Yeah. So they have a number of other improvements that they're including in here. Things like Windows Protected Print, which they're apparently going to be doing away with third-party print drivers. Which, hallelujah for that.
I mean, I think half the red teams in the world are sad now.
Yeah. Support for passkeys in Windows Hello. No, I didn't know that wasn't already there. So that was a little eye-opening to me.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, hot patching in Windows, which is very interesting to me, and I think long overdue. Let's see. Zero Trust DNS. So basically the ability for you to lock your endpoints to a particular DNS server and to not allow them to basically resolve domains outside of that DNS provider.
Which technically isn't zero trust. It's like one trust. I trust one DNS server, maybe two.
I
got to trust something, right?
I can't argue with your logic there.
You know what? This is what happens when marketing people get involved.
Can't argue with you.
It should be called four trust, 4 servers. That's it. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
They clearly need to get you on speed dial. Hey, so here's what we're thinking.
Indeed.
Yeah. So they're also looking at implementing this config refresh option to basically reset systems back to a known good configuration. Which I think that's good. I think it would be better if you could prevent the drift in the first place. But hey, that's, I guess, a good first step.
Well, look, if you give your users some local admin control, it's somewhat inevitable, right? That they're gonna fiddle with things. So I like the concept of it's like a gold image locally, kind of sort of like restore back to known gold, at least from a configuration standpoint. So, if you're fiddling around with things, it's kind of a nice little help desk feature. If this one line in this story is going to be implemented the way I'm thinking about it, so to be determined.
And then the I think the most significant thing, of course, is what we've talked about endlessly since the CrowdStrike debacle. They will be providing a way for security tools like EDR to operate without kernel access.
Which, yeah, we have talked about this a ton, and I'm still very curious to see how it's going to go from a efficacy, performance, and compatibility and competition standpoint. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, one of the big, I'm assuming that they're going to find a way to plumb these security tools, with enough visibility for them to do their jobs. I know one of the challenges, and we've talked about this in recent shows, is that when software runs in user land, it's relatively simple, or at least possible to kill. So as an attacker, you can stop processes, or you can launch processes in the in user land, but you can't do that for kernel unless you have very elevated permissions, and in some instances not even then. And so one of the reasons, as we've talked about in the past, that CrowdStrike I think liked operating in the kernel was that you couldn't kill them if somebody clicked on a phishing link or ran some piece of malware, that malware didn't have the ability to kill the CrowdStrike process in the same way that they could kill some other security software. And so that's going to be more interesting. And I think that's, there's like that knife is going to cut both ways, I suspect, because now you're providing a way for some, I assume, for something to be unkillable in user land. And so how can that be abused? And so it's like, just like the ability to resurrect unbootable systems remotely, does that provide a new avenue for abuse? What kind of avenue for abuse does this open up? And my hope is that the people that are working on this are smart enough to ask these questions. And I'm not like breaking new ground here, but I have questions. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I have questions.
Well, and I'm sure the other aspect that a lot of these guys are thinking about is, okay, if Microsoft's going to build this new methodology where the security tools run in user land and not kernel land, does that include Microsoft Defender? Or is Microsoft Defender still going to have the privilege of running in kernel while nobody else does? And does that become a competitive differentiator that will quickly become an antitrust issue and litigation will ensue?
As has happened in the past, apparently.
Yeah.
So it's a good question.
We shall see. Hey, look, all kudos though that they're working on it. It's all good stuff. I don't mean to just be all negative. I'm glad they're making some of these were just like, wow, why didn't we do this before now? Sort of ideas. So I'm glad they're working on it.
That's a good call out. Like, this was not in any way intended to to dog on them. I think they're doing good work, and I expect these will be meaningful improvements. But there's a lot of uncertainty about the implementation details. That's all.
Yeah. You're just getting old and cranky. It's fine. You can admit it. You missed your nap today. You didn't get to watch your Matlock episode. It's all right.
By the way, did you know there's a new Matlock?
I did.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I've not watched it.
Neither have I, but I feel like I can be old now. Like, anyway. The final story is another CISA report. No article that goes with it, but it's a report from CISA. The title here is Enhancing Cyber Resilience, Insights from CISA Red Team Assessment of a U.S. Critical Infrastructure Sector Organization. So this is a reasonably long readout of a red team, or I guess we would, more commonly call them a penetration test report that CISA did on an unnamed critical infrastructure organization. They don't even tell you what sector they're in. So there's really no identifying information other than they have a mix of Windows and Linux systems. That's about all you can get out of that. But I really liked this summary, and I think there is a little bit of something for everybody in here, because they talk about how they compromise Linux, a Linux environment, and then compromise it at scale, which is not something that you typically think about, because unlike Windows systems, which have this inherent trust relationship through Active Directory, you don't have that with Linux systems. And so the novelty here, in at least in that perspective, is that they did find a way, and the way they found that was through this company's Linux systems all had a NFS. I didn't realize people still used NFS. Like, I thought that went away a long time ago, but apparently they do. So cool. They found that there were dozens or hundreds of people whose Linux home directories were mounted on this NFS share. And because the way they configured this NFS mount to operate when you have root privileges on one of the systems, you can basically get access to everything on this NFS share. And so they were able to go and pluck out lots of SSH private keys, and they got a lot of other useful information, like some certificates and some even information that enabled them to compromise Active Directory. But I thought it was an interesting attack vector to find SSH keys that provided access kind of across the environment. Another aspect that I thought was really interesting was they first started off trying to attack this organization, who, by the way, I should have said it up front, asked to be attacked. Right? They asked CISA to perform this engagement, and so it wasn't like CISA just took it upon themselves.
So you're saying consent is important?
Consent was important. Yeah. Well, they are government agencies, so I don't know how I'm assuming they will all have qualified immunity anyway, but there it is. So they initiated this attack trying spear phishing. So they identified a set of attack targets, I'm guessing through LinkedIn. They did some research to figure out like what kind of workstations they used and what kind of security software they ran. And that turned out not to work. And in fact, they said that one of their victims or one of their targets actually did execute their code, but that this organization was running a piece of security software that CISA's pen testers didn't know about. And that software, they don't mention what it was, but that it blocked that software from running. So it was interesting.
Yeah. I think they said of the 13 targets, one user responded to them and two actually ran their malicious payloads, but they didn't land.
It's two. Okay, it was two.
Yeah, but it's probably something
work.
like malware. Yeah, it was malware bytes, I'm sure.
It was probably malware bytes. Of course.
But hey, first initial takeaway, right? If that triggered an alarm, that might have been given a hint to the SOC. Hey, somebody's up to something, maybe. Or it could have been just, stuff happens all day long. How do you know the difference between what's the beginning of focused, intentional, hard target attack versus just random noise when you get an alert like this is an immediate thought I have. In hindsight, it's perfect 2020. At the time, it's just another alarm. How do you know? It's a good question.
Exactly. So they then pivoted to attacking infrastructure. They looked at, I'm assuming Shodan and other open source intelligence. They identified an application that had a vulnerability, and using some proof of concept code, they actually got a web shell. But where it gets really weird is that once they implanted this web shell, they started poking around and they found that there was already another web shell on the system that was put there by another tester and never removed.
Yeah, it was some sort of like proof of concept for another pen test, right, and just never cleaned up, I guess.
Correct. And that happens, by the way, when if you're not careful, if you engage pen testers who are not diligent, they can leave little messes around that can be exploited. So CISA, their red team, actually at that point reported the web shell, because like the web shell was just open and accessible for anybody to use, and that of course caused this organization to go do an investigation, and they found a lot of, but not all of, the activities of the CISA red team. I think they eradicated all but 4 of their persistence mechanisms, which is still 4. So it's they they could have done better, I guess, at their investigation. But over some time, the engagement changed a bit, and it's a little unclear to me exactly what caused it to change. But this organization, their security team, came to realize that they were being pen tested. And so there was a mutual agreement between the contact at the organization that was coordinating with CISA and their internal teams, that the internal teams would basically hang back and just operate in a monitor mode. And so kind of beyond this point, everything was, there weren't any further attempts by the organization to stop them. They just kind of sat and watched and reported back to CISA what they saw. And so a lot of the report is based on a comparison of what the red team did versus what the company's security team reported, rather than more of an adversarial.
It almost turns into like a purple team at that point.
Right.
If you
exactly.
subscribe to that concept. Yeah.
Exactly. So then they were able to, through a couple of different machinations, they were able to compromise the Active Directory of this organization. They did point out that it was pretty easy to go from their external DMZ, which is where their web server was, to their internal network, because there wasn't a lot of separation. They pointed out that, and I thought this was interesting, that the organization had actually gone so far as to prevent their external DMZ from making unsolicited connections out to the internet. Which is a good practice, by the way. Wasn't such a good...
Tough to do consistently, but yeah.
Right. What wasn't such a good practice was that they had I guess a relatively unmonitored proxy that allowed access out to the internet. So kudos, they blocked access to the internet, but then they provided an avenue to access the internet that apparently wasn't really monitored.
Which is maddening, because the whole point of funneling it through a proxy is to monitor and control it. Come on now.
Right.
Come on now.
Right. So one of the files they found on the on this NFS share had some credentials for an Active Directory account. They were able to log into a system that had unconstrained domain. Their Active Directory on this system was configured for unconstrained delegation, and so basically that allowed them to coerce Active Directory to perform logins on that system and leave behind keys. And basically, they were able to capture enough information that allowed them to impersonate other users in the Active Directory environment, and from there they basically had their run of the domain. And once you're at that point, like, it's game over. You can get on workstations, you can get on servers, you can basically do anything you want. They talk a little bit about some of the persistence mechanisms, like on the on the Linux systems. They modified they modified some cron jobs and the IF up scripts that handle turning up network interfaces to run their persistence scripts. So basically the call out remote shell. Interesting stuff. Like, there were opportunities kind of all over the place, as you might expect. Like, those kinds of things could be detected through file integrity monitoring. But I thought one of the more interesting aspects of this is they do a pretty thorough job of enumerating all of the different takeaways and some more prescription around, rather than just kind of platitudes, like more actionable information. And I'll go through some of that. But there was one quote in here that I thought was very worthwhile reading. And
was that the one where they said that if the target organization had listened to the Defensive Security podcast more, they would have been fine?
I think so. I think yeah. Although, I think that sentence got dropped in the final draft.
Happens all the time.
Yeah. But this sentence is, quote, "This document illustrates the outsized burden and costs of compensating for insecure software and hardware borne by critical infrastructure owners and operators."
Shots fired.
Shots fired. Well, look, as we talked about earlier, CISA, I think, is for a long time, I think they've been somewhat naming and shaming the victims, but I think they're really now focused for the past year or two, at least, on the providers of software. Now, we're not going to rehash all the stuff that we've talked about in regards to, like, what does it take to create reliable and reliably secure software and whatnot. But that's clearly front and center in their mind. They're saying, like, this is not a problem, or not necessarily a problem. This whole report is not necessarily a problem or evidence of a problem by critical infrastructure companies or failing of those companies. It's a problem or failing of the software that they're using. That if they had more secure software, that these problems wouldn't be there. And I mean, that's hard to argue with. Like, I mean, on its face, you can't argue with that. But I think you have to also recognize, what does it take to do that? Like, that's the part that I think it starts to break down. Like, creating really robust software, takes away some flexibility. It costs a lot more. Innovation is slower, and on and on and on. And so that's, I don't know where that thought process ultimately leads, but you can definitely see that that's where CISA is trying to drive this discussion.
Yeah. It's not like you said, it's not an incorrect statement, but in a vacuum, there's always more consideration. There's more inputs to that decision-making process of how they got there. So it's easy to just go, you're dumb for X, Y, Z. Like, these people who are making these decisions usually have a lot of competing priorities that they're trying to balance. It's not that simple, typically. Yeah.
Yeah. So while I'm not going to read through all the lessons learned, I think it's definitely worth your time to read through, especially the second half of this report, which starts with a lesson learned and then goes into some specific mitigation steps. But there were a couple that I wanted to zero in on. And one of them is the lesson learned is on business risk. And it's what they call finding number 7. The organization used known insecure and outdated software. The red team discovered software on one of the organization's web servers that was outdated. After their operations, the red team learned the insecure and outdated software was a known security concern. The organization's security team alerted management to the risks associated with this software. They missed the word there. But management accepted the risk. Next, the security team implemented a VDP program, vulnerability disclosure program, which resulted in a participant exploiting the vulnerability for initial access. I think, by the way, with a web shell. They don't say it, but
yeah. And to be clear, if you don't know the term VDP, because it could be a little misleading, it's not that this company is disclosing their vulnerabilities out. It's for a third-party researcher or random person to contact them and tell them about their vulnerabilities. It's an intake. It's like a bug bounty kind of process, but a little different. So it allows third parties to tell them when they've got problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Good call out. So the VDP program, and I'm continuing on with the quote, the VDP program helped the security team gain management support, and they implemented a web application firewall as the compensating control. However, they did not adequately mitigate the vulnerability as they configured the WAF to only be in monitoring mode. The security team either did not have processes or implemented them properly to scan, assess, and test whether they treated the vulnerability effectively. And I think this is one of the big misses that we have in the security world, writ large. We accept risks all the time. And in fact, we just recorded a podcast with a pretty cool guest who pointed out one of the challenges I think we have as an industry is that people underrate the likelihood, in the likelihood and impact equation. They misunderstand how likely something is to be exploited. And I think this is it kind of aligned with that. And by the way, that's in an upcoming episode of the Getting Defensive Security podcast. So pay attention to your feed. I recommend you like and subscribe.
Shameless plug. Warning. Shameless plug. We need like a sound effect for that.
Yes, indeed. But anyway, back on my thought here. I think we are really good at, as a security organizations, calling out that something is old, something's out of date, what have you. And we're very good at having processes in place where management can sign off on the risk. But the challenge is that I think where we go off the rails is that just accepting the risk doesn't accomplish anything. In effect, I used to work with a lot of lawyers, and one of the lessons I learned was when you accept a risk, that's like exhibit A. You move from ignorance into negligence when you start accepting risks.
Well, I struggle with that a little. The way I look at a risk acceptance program or methodology is that the decision makers who control prioritization of the resource focus of the business,
right,
has been informed of a potential risk and is held accountable to making the right decision with the resources available. Right. So if the decision maker is making, let's say you're a software shop, if the decision maker is making a decision between patching something versus developing a new customer committed functionality, and they can't do both, they've got to make a call. They've got to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that decision is the business decision of delivering that committed bit of functionality to that customer, rolling the dice that vulnerability or that risk is not going to bite you before you can get back around to it. So I don't know if it's negligence so much as it is making a choice.
So when I say negligence, I'm talking in the legal, in the way it would be looked at in a court of law, at least here in the U.S.
Sure.
How the opposing counsel is going to be portraying your acceptance of that risk that caused their client to be harmed. It's not going to be presented as a reasonable business risk. It's going to be presented as you were negligent and you.
You have hung out with a lot of lawyers.
I have.
Okay,
but
fair.
But anyway, so in this particular instance, they went even further though. They not only did they sign off on the risk, but they also said, okay, well, we'll sign off on the risk so long as we have some kind of mitigating control in place. But one of the things I was, I wasn't able to do it all the time, but for certain categories of risks, I found it useful, and again, not everybody can do this, but I found it useful to try to have somebody exploit the problem after we put the mitigating control in place to demonstrate that the mitigation was effective. And I think that's where this, this broke down, is that they put a reasonable control in place that a reasonable person would say would mitigate the risk, but they didn't verify that it actually mitigated the risk.
There's one other possibility here, which is that it was a fairly new deployment of the WAF, and they put it in monitor-only mode while they were still finding and fixing false positives and things that would... If you go straight to block mode in a WAF without tuning it, you're going to break production in a hurry.
Good point.
So I don't know. If it's been in monitor-only mode for a year, yeah, okay. Sorry, no. If it's, if they just stood it up a month ago, I kind of understand the timing issue there.
There's no context. It's a good point. There's no context there. And by the way, WAFs are, as you point out, notoriously hard to configure. In a way
you need
that doesn't break. That doesn't break your application.
If you want a truly effective WAF that has a good balance between false positives and false negatives and isn't breaking production, and isn't blocking legitimate traffic, but is stopping a lot of bad guy traffic, you really have to know your web traffic well. You have to tune it well. A lot of the architecture of these things say, oh, no, it's self-tuning and self-learning and AI and blah, blah, blah. No, you need to stay on top of these things, or it's quickly going to get blamed for a lot of outages, and before you know it, folks in other parts of the company are screaming for the WAF to get turned off, which is not a good outcome.
Yep. Good point. So in addition to all of the recommendations and details on mitigations, they actually do call out some noted strengths, which I thought was a good thing to see. One was that the network team, the defenders, identified the initial compromise and some of the red team activities, and that led them to be able to shut down a lot of the activity. Their EDR, as we talked about before, mitigated the malware that was delivered in their phishing attacks. Apparently, they had a really good password policy, and they had effective separation of privileges. So, and I know, by the way, that not every organization has those, and for every one of those things you don't have, it kind of exacerbates the how easy it is for an actor to move through your environment. So in total, this is, I thought, a really good example of how a more complex attack can happen. And I will go further and say that, I suspect a lot of IT, not necessarily security people, but a lot of IT people will say, well, I've never seen this happen in real life. It's like it's an edge case. But I think one of the challenges is that the type of actor, unless it's one of the more sophisticated ransomware operators, which we are starting to see, right? The type of actor that employs these techniques, you won't know unless you happen to catch them. They will get in, they will do their stuff, and they will get out, and you won't know they're there.
Your mom definitely knew I was there.
I knew I wasn't getting out of this without terrible joke.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
No, you're right. Unless you do a complete forensic and have perfect fidelity, you may not ever even know some of these techniques were utilized.
And so then I guess you're left with the question, if an APT falls in the woods and no one is there to catch it, did it actually happen?
Well, when your data is published for sale on some bad guy forum.
Yeah, I don't know how likely it is. Now, this is obviously a critical infrastructure operator, and so the downside is that an adversary would tunnel in and jump over to an OT network, and dump all the chlorine in the water, or who knows, right? Turn the power off, whatever whatever the bad thing is. But an alternative explanation is that suddenly China has a fighter jet that looks a lot like the JSF.
Right.
Or Russia has something that looks an awful lot like the space shuttle.
Right.
Or, and those are the things that you just don't know. Or maybe like bring it down, like suddenly your competitor in some other country is creating widgets using something that looks like the exact same process that you've spent years innovating.
Or even more basic. Suddenly all of your customer base is being approached by a competitor exactly just under what you're charging them for.
Right.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So not everything is a ransomware attack. And I think that's to some extent ransomware has really, on the one hand, it has been one of the bigger boons for the security world. But on the other hand, I think it's taken our eye off the ball. Because that's the thing we care about. And we also we expect it. Well, you didn't every day I show up and my PC still boots. Like I hey, we did it. Mission accomplished. But that's not the only attack. So anyway, the whole whole report is worth your time to read. Mm-hmm. I'm not gonna go through any more of it, but definitely hope that was useful to you. I learned a lot. I thought it was it highlighted some things that that I hadn't seen before. So good stuff, and I've seen a lot.
Yeah. I really appreciated this, the depth and detail and actionable information that came out of this. And, I think one of the challenges sometimes when you look at a report like this is the tendency to say that the blue teamers or the defending organization has some sort of moral failing or intelligence failing or skill set failing, when that's not typically the case. These are really complex problems. Right. And if you look at, there's some interesting takeaways here about how long it took for certain things to happen, especially once the defending SOC was basically stood down in monitor-only mode. There was a lot of opportunities to detect and disrupt this attack, which I think is important. Like this is never, well, I shouldn't say never, it's rarely a single stage attack. And so even if you can't stop the initial intrusion point or the initial social engineering attack or whatever that is, being able to detect and disrupt some chain along that attack path becomes critical. And I think that's part of where we should also spend our energy and time is, hey, if somebody were to get in, what might be the next thing they do and how might I detect that?
Right. I will say, broadly speaking, a lot went right in this instance. Like if it had been an actual attack, it very likely would have been stopped at some point. Mm-hmm. So that was, kudos on them. And I think from what I read, this organization has a level of maturity that many organizations do not have.
Yeah.
And I raise that because when you read this, you're like, oh my gosh, like this was terrible. But it wasn't, and I genuinely think a lot of non-critical infrastructure companies would struggle. Like they would not have seen most of this.
Yep.
So
I agree.
So there you have it. Anyway, that is the show for today. I hope you found it interesting. We will have links to all these stories on our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. Just a reminder that we have a whole new podcast, by the way, called the Getting Defensive.
Brand new.
Whole new, brand new, called the Getting Defensive Podcast. It features Andy and I interviewing people that are certainly smarter than me. Maybe not smarter than Andy, but smarter than me.
Oh, certainly better than me.
To help explain context behind things that they're passionate about. It's not all business related. As you talked about, some people have have relayed personal experiences on how they got into security, some interesting personal endeavors they had. Amanda Berlin, for example, talks about her work with mental health hackers, and so on. So it's a I think a really great thing. Hopefully, it opens your eyes to new perspectives beyond just what Andy and I talk about, and certainly, we're hoping this is our path to to being, that Joe Rogan money, as you keep saying.
One quick side note is we're trying hard to avoid like sales pitches and like we're trying to like find people doing the job down in the trenches. Like, that's one of our focuses, because we get honestly a lot of pitches of a lot of salesy folks to come on the podcast, and that's something we're avoiding. But if you know somebody really interesting doing some really cool work, even just peripherally related to information security, hey, let us know. We got a whole long list of people already, but we're always looking for new and interesting guests.
Definitely. Yeah, the intention is not for this to become, the marketing vehicle for the latest, security products. Although I'm not going to say that if we find something that seems exceptionally novel or cool, that we won't ever have somebody on to talk about stuff like that. But the intention definitely is to learn, the more about the basics from people who are doing the work. So good. I think it's good stuff, and I'm having a ton of fun. I'm meeting lots of good people, having some good discussions. So I hope you like it too. Anyway, that is the show. Hope you had fun. I had fun. And
if you want to find that new show, just to wrap up our shameless plug, gettingdefensive.com is the website, because how could I not register that domain? It was too perfect. That's right. And also all the major podcast platforms and video. All these are video as well. If you want the video feed, it'll be on YouTube, on the Defensive Podcast channel on YouTube, which is a new channel that we just started. So look, we're getting crazy. We're getting crazy over here with social media.
That's right.
But with that, that's all I got.
All right. You can find me on my lovely Mastodon instance, Jerry at infosec.exchange. What can they find you?
I'm also there on infosec.exchange at Lurg, L-E-R-G, and I'm still an X, hanging out at Lurg there. Those are the highlights.
Take care, everybody. We'll talk again real soon.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.